This is the Porsche 911. It's the iconic sports car that has been the dream of many for decades. And this is the Cayman or Boxster, the second tier platform that isn't quite up to the standard of the 911. It's the Porsche sports car that, let's be blunt, you buy when you don't have the money to buy the one you really want. That unfortunate fella saying the 911 costs too much, well, that was me years ago when I bought a Boxster. When it comes down to it, I'm cheap and I couldn't stomach the extra cost. But when I bought another 981 Boxster, this one, which is a salvage car, which I bought not to put back on the road, but just to strip down completely and to learn all about it, that I realized that when you pull the panels off the outside of this car that make this look like a Boxster, underneath it is pretty much entirely 911. For example, the only thing inside this entire cabin that really makes this any different to a 911 is the shape of the dashboard and the instrument cluster. If you strip off the outer layer, underneath is pretty much the same car with some alterations to the rear chassis and a few minor aesthetic trinkets thrown in. The Boxster, Cayman and 911 were all developed as single platforms, that being the 9X6, the 9X7 and 9X1, with shared development and production costs. Whilst it's no secret there is sharing of parts, this is far, far more extensive than you might believe considering the huge price differential. And what I found most interesting is that if a comparison is made of a like-for-like Cayman or Boxster with an equivalent 911, I would argue that the total cost to produce a single 911 is probably less than a single Boxster or Cayman. Right now, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there screaming, that's crazy talk, but just hear me out and then you can make your own decision. But when you compare like-for-like cars with similar engines, performance and interior specification, the reality is surprising. I must point out that this video is not going to be one that compares the relative merits of each car type. I have no interest in that. I'm just going to set out what I think are some pretty compelling facts about what is really underneath the skin of each and the relative cost to produce these cars so that people can be informed if they are ever faced with the very fortunate choice of buying either of them. Now, I'm going to get down into the weeds a bit of parts lists and development and control system software. I don't want to send you to sleep, but hopefully I'll show just enough to demonstrate the point. Also, a trigger warning: if you paid nearly twice the price to buy a 911 over a Boxster or Cayman, thinking it was a vastly different car, you may feel like you've been taken advantage of by the Porsche marketing machine. It might be best at this time to press pause and watch something else. So before I start, who am I? My name is Jeff Richardson and I'm a self-confessed do-it-yourself car fanatic. I enjoy the driving, but what really floats my boat is pulling them apart, getting my hands dirty and helping others as much as I can. I've been doing this for years in the BMW world, helping others with engine rebuilds, transmissions, convertible roofs, to name a few. And then I moved up in the world. I bought a 981 Boxster S and my trusty BMW 330 convertible was put into semi-retirement. The Porsche is a stunningly well-built car and unfortunately for me, it's far too reliable and never breaks, so I rarely get the opportunity to pull it apart. So a few years ago, I bought another Boxster. This was a water-damaged salvage car that would never make it back onto the road, but was to be a car I could pull apart, use as a learning tool and make as many videos as I could to help others who are as passionate about these cars as I am. I covered every bit of the car I could, such as basic maintenance, suspension, fuel system, interior, upholstery, PDK transmission removal and teardown, and even designing and testing new PDK electrical sensors. I made about 160 videos in all, and it covered pretty much the entire car. However, the thing that struck me when doing all of this was that no matter where I looked, most of the part numbers I saw were prefixed with the number 991. So what does this mean? Any part that was specific to the Boxster or Cayman was going to have the prefix 981, which is the designation of these cars. But anything that came from the 911 had the prefix 991, as this was the designation of the 911 model. So I started sifting through the respective parts lists and doing comparisons, and what I found really opened my eyes. Whilst there's no secret there is some sharing of parts between the different cars, it's the extent of this that is the big surprise. So to do a fair comparison, I'll look at the 911 Carrera 991 version that was produced between about 2012 and 2016, and the 981 Boxster S, which was produced during the same period. Both cars were fitted with the same 3.4 litre Boxster 6 normally aspirated engine and had very similar performance specs. There are many options available for both, but if none were chosen, there was very little difference in the basic specification between the two. So they should be a pretty good comparison. Here in Australia, without any options selected, the on-road price of each was approximately $140,000 for the 981 Boxster S and approximately $250,000 for the 911 Carrera, a $110,000 or 78% increase. So let's start the comparison. Except for the skin on the outside, once you get underneath this skin, nearly everything is the same for both car types when you consider from about here forward. Electrical wiring harnesses, control units, fuel system, brakes, suspension, steering, wipers, radiators, air conditioning condensers. It's all the same with only a few small differences in some places to suit each individual model, such as the individual specification of the suspension springs and dampers to cater for the different vehicle weight and handling characteristics. Here's an example. This is the entire front chassis section forward of the cabin, here in the parts list and here on the car. Yes, it's exactly the same part for both the 911 and the Boxster or Cayman. Inside the cabin was the biggest surprise, as I personally thought the interior would be a significant upgrade in the 911. As you would expect, the base 981 uses some lower quality materials unless you pay to upgrade, but the standard 981S is much the same as the 911 Carrera. So let's start with what's the same. Whilst the door on the outside and the window are a different shape, everything else is the same. The window regulator, locking mechanism, subframe, door control unit, mirror, door handle, speakers and the inside trim are all the same, except the grab handle here on the 911 is all leather rather than a single patch, and there are these decorative strips added. The glove box and all the trim below, the entire center console is the same, including the communication center, gear shift and all the switch sets. The switch sets will have a few more or less buttons depending on the options fitted to a particular car, but the electronics underneath are the same for all. The badge in the middle will say Carrera rather than Boxster or Cayman, but that's really the only difference. Same steering wheel and surrounding trim, and for the most part the same seats. There are many seat options available, but they are all 991 parts. The base level non-memory seats for the 981 are manually adjusted with handles, with the 911 adjustment being electric. Behind the dashboard is full of air conditioning, electronics and a frame that holds it all in place, and this is all the same. Even the chassis underneath the floor is essentially the same. The floor panels, tunnel and rear firewall that run under the seats and come up here are the same parts, as this is where the rear seats start in the 911. So what of substance is different? Only the shape of the dashboard with the associated air vents and the instrument cluster. That's it. The 911 dashboard is the traditional 911 shape, and the 911 5-dial instrument cluster is internally exactly the same as the 3-dial one fitted to the 981, except it has additional analog dials fitted to the outside. To be honest, the dashboard shape was one of the things that did turn me off the 911 when I was looking to buy, as to me, it looks like something from an old Ford truck rather than a sports car, but that's just me, and over time I've worked out that my brain works a little bit differently to others. Note that the same significant upgrades to interior trim are available for both car types if you are prepared to pay for the option, but if you don't pay for this, then the material used in the base level of trim is the same. I hear people say that the 911 interior is screwed together better. It's not. To be frank, they are constructed stunningly well and are a credit to the engineers who designed it, but to a nut and bolt, they are the same. Whilst it also might seem logical that the 911 cabin is larger, it's not, as all the structures both below and above are identical. The major differences between the two cars is from here back, because the engine and transmission are swapped around in the different cars. The 911 is rear-engined, meaning it has the engine behind the rear axle and the transmission mounted forward of this. In the Boxster or Cayman, that same engine transmission combination is flipped around so the engine is forward of the rear axle. There are pros and cons of both, which I won't get into in any serious depth here, but with the transmission being far smaller and narrower than the engine, this enables the 911 to have rear seats as the transmission sits between them, but it also allows the Cayman or Box to have what is considered better weight distribution and an additional cargo area at the rear, but it loses the rear seats. Whilst each of the respective cars needed to be developed differently at the rear to cater for these differences, the equipment of substance inside the rear of each is pretty much the same. The mechanical components in the 3.4 litre engine found in the 911 Carrera and 981S are identical, except for one change. The 981S engine is deliberately detuned, so it has less power than the 911. This has been done by fitting the 981 engine with a smaller throttle body and associated intake manifold, and is tuned differently. Rumour has it that this was done to ensure the Boxster or Cayman S wasn't faster than the 911 Carrera, as the 911 is a slightly heavier car. Because the orientation is flipped around, there are some small differences in the respective engines, so they can connect to things like cooling pipes, fuel lines, and to ensure access to components for maintenance. But in terms of development and production cost, they are identical. The transmissions are essentially the same, both having either the 7DT45 double clutch transmission or 6-speed manual supplied by ZF. The only real difference is that the differentials are on opposing sides to cater for the engine transmission orientation being reversed. Otherwise, one would have 6 or 7 reverse gears. Whilst the front suspension McPherson strut setup is the same, the rear suspension setup is different on the two cars. The rear setup on the 981 is very similar to what both car types have at the front, as the weight distribution on the 981 is better. But with the engine behind the rear axle in the 911 and the associated rear biased weight distribution, the 911 has a different multi-link setup to deal with this. The panels, bumpers and lighting you see on the outside of each of the cars are clearly different, but the relative development and production costs for each would be pretty much identical. A large part of the development of a platform is the development of the production facilities and tooling. These cars and engines are assembled in the same facilities on the same production line as can be seen here. So the costs associated with each of these would be the same. So after looking closely at all these parts and components, I then had a dive into the car's electrical control and programming. The Porsche diagnostics and programming tool used in both the dealerships and factory is called POES. This is what it looks like when you first open the program, and it clearly gives you the indication that the 911 is a different platform to the Cayman or Boxster. However, when you dig into the file structure, it tells you a different story. If you were to dig down into the files that hold all of the programming that controls all of the units in the car and the associated instructions of how to load them, here is what you find. Down here is where it lists all of the different modern platforms that Porsche make. You can see Panamera, Cayenne, this Cayman is actually the Macan, the 918 Spider, and finally up the top you have 9X1. That's right, a single platform for all. Elsewhere in the file structure you can also find every other platform that Porsche has ever made, including 9X6 and 9X7. Inside here, it has all of the files that are loaded onto the various control units and the associated loading instructions for both the 981 and 991. Some of the files are common for every car, for example, the electronic park brake and the electronic power steering shown here. For some, like the DME, which is the engine control unit, there are a huge number to cater for the many combinations of engine type, year of manufacture, and all the numerous emission standards that exist around the world. The program simply uses the instructions to find the particulars of the car and then load the correct flash file into that control unit. I'll point out here that all of the individual control units installed in the different cars are identical, meaning, for example, that the engine control unit installed in the 991 is identical hardware to what is installed in the 981, with the only difference being the slightly different code that is installed to suit that car. What I did find interesting is that it also holds the engine and transmission flash files for the 982, which is the internal designation for what is now badged the 718, with the remainder of the 982 using common coding to the 981 and 991. So as far as Porsche is concerned, the 982 is also part of this 9X1 platform. I've needed to search and use all of this a good bit, and it's extremely clear once you dig into it that the underlying architecture and coding of the two car types is identical, with the small changes in coding only done to cater for the differences in specific models. It's clear that all of the programming development was done as one, and the development costs for all of this is shared. So from what I can see, there would be very little difference in the development or production cost of either car, even though the rear chassis section of each has been developed separately. The 911 has rear seats and a small amount of additional trim, but the added cost to develop and produce this would be minimal. But didn't I say before that the total cost of production of a 911 was less? The thing is that Porsche sells many more 911s than they do Boxsters or Caymans combined, so the development costs for the 911 are recouped over many more cars sold. So what are the Porsche production figures? Over the period of 2013 to 2016, when the 981 and 991 were in production, Porsche sold approximately 125,000 911s and approximately 96,000 combined Boxsters or Caymans. So the fixed development costs for the platform, which would run into the billions, are recouped over the sale of many more 911s than Boxster or Caymans. So these costs per unit are actually less for a 911. I'm going to make an educated guess here to illustrate my point. Let's say that the total development cost of the 9X1 platform was $5 billion before taking into consideration the high-end vehicles like the GT3 and similar. Yes, developing a car is very expensive, especially if the car is a completely new platform, which is what the 981 and 991 were. I suspect this figure would actually be more than this, but I'll use this number for demonstration. So if we allocate half the development cost to each, that's $2.5 billion for the 991 and $2.5 billion for the 981, and then divide that by the number sold of each, you get about $20,000 per car for the 991 and about $26,000 for the 981. That's $6,000 more for the 981, which is certainly much more than the small additional cost of actually making a single 911 car. Like I said previously, this same overall comparison can be made for the previous platform generations. The 996 and 986 were developed as a single platform named the 9X6, and the 997 and 987 were developed as a single platform named the 9X7. However, it does seem that the comparison doesn't apply to the latest generation of the 911, the 992, as the 982 or 718 is an addition to the 9X1 platform, and the 992 seems to have been developed in isolation. Of note though, the DNA of the 718 Cayman GT4 RS, a car that is widely regarded as the best Porsche ever built, well, that DNA comes from this modest machine, so it can't have needed too much improvement. The more I dig into this, the more I'm convinced of its validity when viewed objectively. It will most likely put a smile on the face of some and a frown on others. The Porsche marketing machine is prolific, and they spend a lot of money and do a lot of work to convince you that this car is the same as this. The truth is that this car is much more like this one. Does it justify the price difference? Well, that's entirely up to the individual who opens up their wallet and then gets to sit behind the wheel.